Right now, we are a truly global community. These numbers are proof positive that today's topic matters, underscoring the urgent need to address the challenges we face through our collective design practices. As we prepare to launch forward into today's event, here are a few housekeeping notes for our audience today. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be available after the Design Impact event on our website. The event will launch with a keynote by esteemed Harvard GSD professor David Moreno Mateos, followed by 2 expert panels. For those of you on Zoom, please do ask your questions through the Q&A function. The chat function is also available for you to share your thoughts and comments with the entire audience throughout the event. And for those of you on Facebook and YouTube, you can simply post your comments there. And now it is my profound honor to introduce my dear friend and fellow GSD Alumni Council member, Haya Kader. Haya is a mother, architect, and consummate change agent. Launched this year in her native Costa Rica, Haya's most recent initiative, Regen Design Lab, explores eco-design for regenerative communities. Please give a warm, worldwide welcome to Haya.
Thank you, Anna, for that warm introduction and for your inspiring and tireless leadership in service of our design impact initiatives and the world. It is truly an honor to be here to welcome all of you, most distinguished panelists and guests, to this panel on regeneration. There could not be a more auspicious time to gather and explore the potential for creating anew. Which determined first, as hope and renewal emerged triumphantly following times of collective hardship. As we become increasingly aware that the green strategies of the last few decades are not sufficient to ensure a sustainable future for our children, regeneration emerges as the dawn for transformation. For many of us engaged in design fields, it is easy to remain behind the seductive veil of beauty, and more so if supported by generic sustainable practices. Nonetheless, as we ponder upon the imprint that our actions as architects, landscape architects, and planners leave behind, the concept of beauty expands beyond its physical dimension. Since time immemorial, beauty has served as a compass for elevating our spirits in the pursuit of evolution. The contemplation of beauty, said Plato, causes the soul to grow wings. I believe this is the promise of regeneration. It provides a framework for dreaming of the world we want to create and not feel bound by systems that no longer serve us. It offers a platform from which to heal ourselves and our planet, one person and one place at a time. Tapping into the unique inherent potential of all living systems within place, regenerative initiatives advocate community building, inclusiveness, and foster a relational perspective with ecosystems that is inspired by a reverence for the infinite wisdom found in nature. Over the course of the next 3 hours, we will hear from an extraordinary roster of experts that will explore alternative new whole systems design. During our first panel, Regeneration, a Paradigm Shift, we will hear from Kyokasin Ghost Horse, an indigenous peace leader who honors us with his presence in this panel and who will enlighten us with the languages of regeneration. Carol Sanford, a leading exponent of regenerative economics, will then outline for us the main principles of regeneration. Finally, Bill Reed, a leading regenerative design and planning consultant, will inspire us with the blessings of integrating whole living systems into our work. During the second panel, Regenerative Design, System Technologies and Strategies, we will hear from leaders across the disciplinary divide who will share their work and initiatives as tools for regeneration. Walter Meyer will share projects at the forefront of resilience and how they were instrumental in affecting changes in national policy for development. Atosa Soltani will inspire us with her Indigenous rights and rainforest campaign initiatives. Tom Newmark will share the latest scientific findings with regards to regenerative agriculture and landscape, which hold the promise of great impact for climate mitigation. Victoria Kazaya will inspire us to learn from nature's wisdom through the practice of biomimicry. Finally, Eva Long will help us understand that regenerative initiatives start with a practice of self-inquiry as we contemplate upon not so much the what or how of what we do, but the why. The work ahead to use design as a tool to repair our world at the intersection of health, equity, and climate change is vast and humbling. As designers, we've been trained to surrender to the unknown, to explore solutions without preconceptions, as experience helps us recognize that this practice leads to best results. On behalf of the GSD Alumni Council and our Design Impact Initiative, I invite our community of designers to step out of our silo and join policymakers, NGOs, academics, entrepreneurs, activists, Indigenous leaders, community networks, philanthropists, scientists, and ecologically minded individuals as we open our hearts and minds to regeneration and step into the potential that our creative capital could yield in supporting regenerative initiatives worldwide. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, David Moreno Mateos, Assistant Professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the GSD. David is a restoration ecologist dedicated to understanding the long-term recovery of ecosystems degraded by human development. David, please enlighten us with your insights.
Thank you, Haya. Thank you very much. Well, I could not agree more with you in how designers have an amazing role to play in the future, but by broadening the scale that landscape is kind of usually, design is usually perceived. So it's great, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm so happy to be here, and I will try to enlighten. I'm not sure how far I will be able to go, but let me share my screen here just a second. Okay, no, this is not the screen, sorry. I missed the right screen. This, are you seeing? Let me. No, I need to change. Okay, are you seeing my, like the forest, not the presenter's view, just to confirm?
David, we are seeing your presenter view, so please change that setting.
Okay, so this is weird because I just did it, I was the opposite. Okay, anyways. Okay, now is the presenter's view.
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm going to talk today about like 3 key ideas. So one is complexity, the second is time, and the other one is change. And to understand complexity, I always like to see a tropical forests. Like this one here is an old growth forest it's an oak forest in the highlands of Costa Rica. And what amazes me about nature is the complexity of itself. So seeing this image is telling you like how many species are interacting in this precise moment, in this particular place. And we're talking only about plants, but if you think about the insects that are actually interacting with these plants, the bacteria, all the soil communities, the birds, and the mammals are also living here at the same time, this is really an amazing structure that is actually making life exist on Earth. Well, the problem is that we are kind of messing up a little bit the Earth. So just very few brief facts of what we have been done so far to make sure that we are all understanding the impact of human presence on the planet. And one of the main impacts on nature is land use change. So we have already transformed about a little over half of the terrestrial Earth to agriculture, which is insane. So this is a real picture from Philippines, where you can see how we are taking a lot of more than half of nature to our benefit to live, which, I mean, it makes sense. We have to live too in this planet. There is another alarming date. So we are losing about 3 to 4% of the primary forests every year, still like today. So like this one here, this is illegal gold mining in Brazilian Amazon. So the data is showing that we are today destroying kind of nature at the highest rate ever, which is something that we should think about, which is kind of having an impact on nature. So we have lost about 60% of all the vertebrate populations only in the last 40 years. We have lost about 14% of biodiversity since the industrial revolutions in the last, let's say, 150 years. And this goes up to 40% in most of the northern countries, including North America, Europe, and most of Eastern Asia. So in the end, what we have basically got is to triple the extinction rates over the last 100 years. Extinction rates are basically how many species we are losing per unit of time. So the problem is that every time we get species lost due to human development, we are weakening the web of life. This is a very simplified ecological network of the different species, which are each of these dots in these lines. Hopefully you could see they're like dots aligned. Those are the species, and the links are those associations or those relations they have with other species in their ecosystem. And this is a pretty much simplified system. This is this farm in England, which probably is not as complex as used to be when it wasn't a farm, probably many centuries or even millennia ago. So this simplified ecological network is basically relating. Let me get my pointer. 1 second, please. Here. Okay. Hope you see my pointer. So what you can see here is the plant community. Each of these little dots are a plant species that interacts with all these kind of insects, flower visitors, or other insects that are eating their leaves, and other birds and rodents. So all this complexity takes a long time to build, as you can imagine. Going back to our Costa Rican forest, that big oak in the middle is almost 500 years old. So if you log this forest, as we are doing most of the primary forests on Earth, this forest would take to recover at the very least 500 years. So the issue of time is critical when you're thinking about kind of design or using ecological processes, ecological components in your projects. So things take a lot of time to happen in nature. And we have another layer of complexity, which is, we already talked about land use change, but the other layer of huge complexity is climate change. So this is data on how much we can expect to have to affect the sea level rise in this particular case is South and Eastern Asia. And the map shows in the dark red areas are the kind of the areas of highest risk. As it goes in this gradient towards kind of yellow, whitish, you have less impact of potential sea level rise by 2100. So this is basically this is telling us that between 2.3 and 1 million and 1 billion people will need to be moving away from these places because we will be inhabitable in less than 100 years, which is actually pretty much like nothing from an ecological perspective, and literally like a second from a geological perspective. So there are two things that emerge from this huge change that is happening in the world. The first is that all these people will need to move somewhere else. So we need to find places, find space for those people. And the other thing is that what are you going to do with all this land that mostly won't be underwater? It's just land that's going to be flooded on a permanent basis, or not permanent, on a regular basis by storm surges or typhoons or all kinds of speculatively increasing climate events. So, and here's what I think designers have to change, or should, or I recommend at least to change the scale at which you're thinking. How are you going to deal with all this land, and how are you going to deal with all these people? So, for example, this is one example of the work that we've been working in last year on trying to address sea level rise in coastal communities in the Philippines. Actually, one of the most and one of the places at the most risk due to climate change, heavily affected by typhoons, almost every year. So these coastal communities are extremely vulnerable. So how do we deal with that? So what I encourage students is to think about one approach that we call ecosystem-based adaptation, which is using ecosystems or ecosystem processes to adapt to climate change and land use change. We usually work together in many different ways. So for instance, in this place, we could restore mangroves, which is something that would help these communities to be better protected against climate change, because mangroves actually attenuate the wave energy. And so the impact of the waves in the shorelines is much lower. So the communities are actually protected. There was an interesting study a few years ago showing that communities protected with mangroves have less chances to actually lose people, like deaths, than communities were open to the ocean. So the approach here is to integrate ecosystem processes, ecological components in these systems to not only protect people from climate change, but also increase biodiversity and all the huge benefits that we have from biodiversity, and also to share the earth with other organisms other than people. It's like, that's something that kind of I like to emphasize. It's like we must be able to live with someone else, not rather than ourselves. So in this particular case, we're thinking, okay, we can restore mangroves, but we can also improve aquaculture in the protected parts of the mangrove. Mangroves are extremely productive ecosystems that are really good to produce fish for the local communities, but also including like constructed wetlands to reduce the pollution of the mangrove coming from the local communities. So this is just an example of how integrating ecological components to adapt to climate change and in the context of climate change, basically. So the thing is that we have several tools to do this. We have restoration, we have regenerative design, which I think are two key tools to address the changes that are already here, and they are going to only increase over the coming decades. So this last study is showing us where are the most important places to prioritize restoration for the coming decades. The red is where we should put more emphasis. The blue is where we should put less emphasis. As you can see, most of these places are in the southern hemisphere and tropical regions. The interesting thing about this study is that it was quite optimistic, because they found that by restoring 15% of the converted lands, we could avoid 60% of the extinctions, while we would get other benefits like carbon storage. We could store actually 30% more CO2, but you have also increased livelihoods for people. You have more protection for coastal communities. You have many other benefits for people and for nature. And finally, we could do that, according to this study, by also ensuring that we have food for everyone. They found that if we restore a little over half of the land has been already degraded, and also given the current amazing advances in agricultural efficiency, we could actually have food for everyone. So finally, to close, I just want to encourage you, designers, to think deeply on nature, including ecological components in your projects, and also think broadly. So this is a global change. So we need to think broadly, and everyone, I think designers have an extremely good position to do that. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, David, for leading the path of design for ecological restoration at the GSD. David's career spans the continental divide. Upon receiving his PhD at the Spanish National Research Council, his academic career continued at Berkeley, Stanford, the Center of Scientific Research in France, and the Basque Center for Climate Change in Spain. His classes on applied ecology are in high demand amongst their students, and his scientific research clarifies the urgency of the challenges we face. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Julia Smatula, who will moderate our first panel. A recent doctor in design at the GSD, Julia is an urban planner and designer whose research is situated in urban theory, planning, and political ecology. Her recent work on environmental conservation focuses on stewardship practices. She's currently a teaching associate at Harvard GSD and an adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo. But before we get started with our panel, one of our distinguished panelists, Carol Sanford, will take a couple of minutes to share the epistemology for regeneration as preparation for us to challenge how we know and open our minds to different paradigms for learning and absorbing new information. Carol, please enlighten us.
Thank you, Haya. You may notice, in spite of what Anna said, that you can't use your chat room. We requested that because I believe regeneration has its a particular epistemology, how we learn, how we know. And normally that is an expert, which you also hold us, were introduced as. So regeneration has an epistemology that is not divided, not expert and audience. And it's not about knowledge transfer. So today we're hoping during the time you're with us, at least for the first panel, that your work is reflection on you, on two things. Regeneration itself as an epistemology is always specific to a moment, to a place, to being. It's not just, generic and broad. So I ask you if you would observe two things, an inner and an outer working of yourself, and maybe write it down on a piece of paper and avoid using technology for the moment. And what you might observe is regeneration always invites disruption, disruption from what we thought we already knew. You might, as you listen to us, ask and not take notes about what we say, but you're inviting yourself to be disrupted by, what you're open to, and also what's happening to you. What do you notice about your own desire to take notes of the expert compared to what your own mind is generating and your own being state is generating? So I hope you'll do that. And then we're going to move away from not having a Q&A. Again, that's expert audience. And instead ask for your reflections around those observations. And we may or may not engage with you because then it's our base. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, for providing this epistemological framing. We're really excited to get started with our first panel entitled Regeneration, a Paradigm Shift. And our first speaker, who's going to be sharing his knowledge with us, is Teo Kassan Ghost Horse. Teo Kassan is a member of the Cheyenne River Lakota Nation of South Dakota and is an international speaker on peace, Indigenous, and Mother Earth perspective. Teo Kassan has a long history of Indigenous activism and advocacy. He is a guest faculty member at Yale University's School of Divinity, Ecology, and Forestry, focusing on cosmology, diversity, and perspectives on the relational egalitarian versus rational hierarchical thinking process of Western society. Teo Kassan, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're so honored to have your wisdom in our midst.
Thank you very much, everybody. It is an honor to be here, and thank you for the great respect of gathering all these peoples, either to listen or to show that the experience is, to me, more valuable than the information and the knowledge and even the wisdom. And I think I'd rather refer to how I grew up with the Native point of view and perspective, where we always are in our language, we are always involving in regeneration. And as far as we know, 7 generations is how we affect, and our language needs to be effective this way. So I'll talk a little bit about the language, and mainly to begin with, you have to realize this and then check yourself where you may wonder whether this will have to do with some reality? Can you work this within your reality? And often not, people need to think about it, but have intuitive values about what I'm saying here. So I'm going to begin basically that in many indigenous languages across the planet, and as far as my studies have been doing, completed around the world about different indigenous languages. I'm not a linguist in that expert way, but I've experienced many indigenous cultures throughout the northern hemisphere as well as the southern hemisphere, if that could be thought about. And so when I'm thinking about these values of how we do not have a word for or a concept for domination. Now think about that. We have no word for domination and no concept. Our language is primarily verb based, and it describes the energy and the emotion of what you would say is nature. And with that, it comes the value of intuition, and intuition basically has for us without domination is the we'll check yet, and I can't describe this, but it's basically prayer and respect and compassion and honesty and generosity, humility, and I would say knowledge or wisdom, woksapi. And when we value those so much that in our teepee values, and the word teepee is known all around the world. It's a Lakota word, and basically it means home or home of the stars here on earth. And when we are in putting up a teepee, these 7 values are put into place. And I'm going to describe that in a story that happened in South Dakota, where I was born and raised, and knowing the values of the teepee poles that were put into place, as well as the covering. But I won't go into the detail of that. I want to share a story with you about a place in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, which is this area is the western half of South Dakota is the geographical center of North America. And so the Lakota were one of the last peoples to be touched, I guess, by Western expansion. And when we understand that, we have about 170 to 80 years since we were touched. And when we understand that, we also are less away from the colonization and how to think in a different way. It is so now, but that primary thought process is coming from how we live with the earth. And so, and when we put our teepees up, it's because the earth gives us permission. Now, this is to say that Mother Earth to us has always been an alive being, so to speak. And anything to do is that we asked those elders, and in this case, Earth is our eldest, and shows us where to put teepees up. There's other values within that. So I'm going to go back to the story about this an architect who came out to South Dakota many years ago. I think it was in the 70s, early 80s, and they were going to ask so many architectures to bid on who would build this college, many buildings, and they were going through a process of interviewing different architects, and they came with many plans and very impressive and low cost. Materials were cheap, and it just went through that whole process. Then they came upon one person, and this is the person they were looking for. And they asked each of these architects until this one person, where would you put this college in this land, 1.3 million acres? And so many of them said, well, we'll put it wherever it's convenient, by the road or whatnot. And once this process of interviewing this architect came through, the last one, actually, he said that I would like to go to the land. And so he walked the land for approximately 2 weeks. And once he walked every day miles, and he came upon one place, and then he felt through intuition, and he said this would be the place. And then the elders of the Lakota people came out, and they said, this is, you're the person who's going to build, because this is where exactly where the language of regeneration would be taught. Ake Wokiksuya means to remember again. In other words, deeper meaning means that the land remembers the experience that we have given to earth. In other words, how we live on the earth or with the earth, basically. And there are other design values we have with the teepee. In case examples would be one where in 1992, and Hurricane Andrew, I think it was Category 5 hurricane, landed in Florida. And on this particular native reservation in Florida, the Seminole, and they had built these brand new hurricane-proof buildings. At the same time, they were having a celebration, and they actually put up 10 teepees of the northern plains, and 10 teepees and were erected along with the new buildings, and along came the hurricane. And in this hurricane, it devastated most of those built Western designed houses and homes and buildings, but 9 of the 10 teepees were still standing. Now, this value of the teepee, if you ever been to South Dakota, there's a great deal of wind and not many trees. So there's a great deal of high winds and tornadoes. Well, the teepee was designed for that land to withstand, built in a conical manner where it withstood. It withstood the winds and the hail and just about everything that you could think of, and was insulated in a good way. And it was of least materials as possible. And I think that in describing what and thinking about what David Matios said, is that now we have this idea about, alternative, which to me as a native person doesn't make sense, because I think in the Western way, we're talking about alternative, but in a native way, we're looking at, well, maybe you're talking about your alternative is our native way. And I think that's the trend. So this intuitive intelligence that is still available to all of us would be to do those things that would seem very, quaint, I would say. English is my second language. The values that Native peoples have with the land and have lived there for thousands of years previous to the so-called modern era. And the regeneration process is speaking that language of regeneration up to the 7th generation and further. And when I think about what an example lately that happened was at the Animas River, which is a 126-mile river in southern Colorado going into New Mexico, that it was, they released, or they had an accident of in situ mining chemicals and things, and made the river yellow, and it killed all the fish. And so immediately upon hearing this, many of the Native people came out and they began to sing their songs. And in that stretch, a few miles stretch that they lived, is these songs actually started to clean up from that one point to the northern point. And you see, it's about the land, it's remembering the language of the land. And I think these are examples that we are actually, missing from, all the assessment and measurements and acreage and design and materials and cost, and where Native people are not really thinking about that. Today we have to, because we're actually having to live like the Westerner. And so when I think about how less material, cheaper, not economic, and especially if we design the new way to design, you can go all over the world and see. I don't think I'm telling you anything new here. You can go all over the world and see indigenous peoples and how they build with the land, not on the land, but with the land. And I say this because they have achieved a certain peace with the earth and not the domination of peace on the earth, because they have to be in relationship with that, with the value of understanding the land, first of all. And just a smaller example would be how if you put honey into some water, and two types of honey, one is processed honey and the other one is original honey. And if you put honey into a water, the processed honey will not turn into a honeycomb at the bottom. And you put the original honey in the bottom of the water, and you could see it forming the original shape of the honeycomb, the beehive that came out of. And this is what I'm saying. If you can go there metaphorically with me, you'd understand that the language is already in allowing the earth, allowing us to build there. So I think it's primarily what I'm trying to say is that we need to start asking how to regenerate, rather than and the one where we've been educated. Basically, we've how do I say this? We've educated the wisdom out of ourselves by too many facts. And there's no room for the intuitive value. So close here, there was a teacher in 2008, I believe, who was New York State's Teacher of the Year, and he was retiring. And what he basically said that, and I'm paraphrasing, that it takes 12 years for the average Western educated student, first grade to 12th grade, to learn how to become reflexive to authority. And they establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. And there's many other integrating functions like the conformity function, and the school is meant to determine each student's proper social role. And this is the way you're going to do it. You follow this program. And so we opened up with one of the statements or words was alternative. And so I think it is eminent that we will all return to this intuitive thinking and the values behind that a lot of indigenous peoples all over the world show. And it has not to do with the mental capacity as so much it has to do with how much you're intuiting from the values of thinking with the heart, the Chante Oganaka, we call it the eye of the heart, where your perspective is about, applying mystery to everything that you're doing, to all life that is out there. And I wanted to say that because I know we are going to be saturated with a lot of ideas and maybe use creation, overuse the word creation and imagination, but we need to actually go back into the hearts to really understand, are we doing this with earth in mind first? So in that way, I like to say thank you for listening to me. And if this goes somewhere, then I would be so honored to have that within the discussions in your future. Thank you.
Tio Casson, thank you for introducing us to the role of your language in the regeneration process and in knowing and building with the land. Next, we have Carol Sanford, who's a founder and leader of the Regenerative Business Development Community and the Regenerative Change Agent Development Community. She is recognized as a thought leader working with Fortune 500 and new economy executives in designing and leading systemic business change and design. She's also a prolific author and inspirational speaker. Carol is also the Senior Fellow for Social Innovation at Babson College. Her books have received numerous awards and accolades, and they're required reading at leading business schools. Carol, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Julia. I appreciate that. Let me put my PowerPoint up here. Today, I would like to speak with you briefly about how we know whether we're really working in a regenerative mind, and introduce you to what a paradigm might look like that was about regeneration. I find that as Westerners, although I did have my maternal grandparents were Mohawk descendant of the Iroquois Nation, and I got the benefit of that. I never lived in a deep culture, but working with Thomas Kuhn, which I got to do at Berkeley as an undergraduate, I learned how to teach my mind to differentiate what paradigm I'm in. And I would offer to you to think about that one of the ways that we could define what a lot of the modern Western world look like that has lost what Tokasan is talking about is an extract value culture, going to take things from others, from planet, from social systems. And we have an opportunity, as David said, to be a part of, to live with. We also tend to sometimes move out of that, and we move into what I would call the arrest disorder paradigm, where now we see ourselves as paying attention and taking on the work for people, planet, social systems. But this work is all about arresting disorder or doing less harm. And if you think about your own practice, and invite each of you who are either on this call now or listening later to pause for a moment and start to look at your own practice and notice why and when we end up in an extract value mode compared to we have moved ourselves into one that wants to do less harm. But even that is not into the nature of understanding and being with. At some point, we begin to realize that we have to go beyond the less bad, the less harm to a life shed. I call them that because I think watershed is a fragmenting idea and very anthropocentric. And we will move beyond that and into what might be called the do good. Many of the executives I work with begin to say, well, I a long time ago moved out of extract value, but then I got stuck for a while, and you can see my little arrow over on the side. I got stuck first in doing less harm, in movements and programs and certifications that were all about I could prove I was doing less, and I want to do good. And so they move more into the do good mode. But the do good means who's good. And if what we're doing is moving into cultures where we bring our good, that's also what's called colonizing. And we can do that with philanthropy too. So we do know that there are different ways to move. I believe that the idea of regeneration is a very different concept than doing on the earth, doing for people. It is being, as Tokasan said, with. And we move from thinking of doing to understanding a place, of being, a life shed, and there we want to evolve its capacity for its own essence expression. And we have to be very quiet to do that. We have to learn to see the world as alive and moving. One of the things I gained from my grandfather was the introduction to 7 first principles. And today I'm going to give you my words for them in a very quick shorthand way. They are based on, and I'm going to do the 2 sides of this, a closed system or extract value view, or a best or evolved capacity that's based on living systems. In your own mind, hold these so that you can see where it's the same as I was doing with the hierarchy of paradigms of thinking. And you can hear it in I think you'll probably hear it in all the speakers, but getting back to the idea of a whole has an aspiration. It's a place. There isn't a fragmented view where we go look at a quote watershed and divide water from food and rivers, all separated from one another. We come to it as a whole and bring ourselves as a whole. If we don't go toward the whole, we end up with the fragmentation, which now gives us a problem. All right, I'm dissecting frogs and I have to label them. Now I have forelegs and back legs and all the other parts of a frog. I now am so fragmented, I start to have categories for frogs and for people. So you go into an organization, and because you don't know how to see each individual as a whole being, you fragment them into the problems they have, the strengths, the weakness. You get all these lists, core competencies, and then you can categorize people. And of course, the minute you've got categories, you have to have some generic definition of what goes in that box. There is another way, which is to come and be with, the way I would describe, and not as a replacement, but as my experience, is the way to get from the whole to something that is real, is the essence of each living being. Each place on earth, in small and larger forms, has its own story, has its own essence. It's the way to get out of the trap we're in with categories where everyone is one of a type. You've got a typology and a category of what they're good at and how it ranks and rates with others. If you can take essence and you can look at it in a unique whole being, so if you have children, think about one of your children and think about them as a whole with their own essence. And what it is that makes them who and what they are, that if that were not there, they would not be themselves. Now you have their potential, not some teacher's generic idea of they're not living up to their potential, which is over here on the left, problems, issues. But instead, you can develop and bring forward that specific potential to support that essence. Remember, my definition of regeneration was evolved capacity, and it means for essence expression. Otherwise, we end up back on my left-hand side. Now, just look, if you fragment, you got to categorize. Now, what you do is everyone who doesn't fit in a category, every piece of land that doesn't, or every market you're working in doesn't fit, you have problems and issues, and now you got to work on those. And you're working only from fragments, not from a whole. If you can stay with the whole, with its essence, its potential, now you can be in the fourth principle, which is about development. Everything is about evolving capacity and joining with that. So when I ask you today not to try and take notes about what we're saying, it will go away, and what we say may not even be right. What you want is to grow your own being, your own will, and shift it toward being able to connect with wholes. Otherwise, we start seeing some people, some places, we try and get knowledge about a place and know its geography and type of soil so we can put it in our categories rather than coming being with the place that you live. When you hear Takasan talk about going into a place, it's beautiful because you know that it's specific. They're with the place. They're not predetermining and fixing in their mind a place. They also see the world as nested, as alive, as engaging in a dynamic way with others. And they are able, therefore, to be with something alive. Otherwise, what we end up doing when we got our categories is we aggregate unlike things. But so particularly in the world of regeneration, people say, this is regeneration, restoration, sustainability, donut, all of those get lumped into a category. And we can't learn to see the world as nested with a life shed nested in a place on the planet. And then, oh, whoops, I don't know what I did there. All right. The final two things which we have to move out of to shift from the extract value paradigm is our idea of scaling everything. People often say to me, well, your work is wonderful, but it doesn't scale. I say, you don't need to scale. What you do is you go be with a place and you work nodally, like the acupuncturist works, being able to touch and feel something as alive and specific. If not, what we tend to do is work to try and make something bigger and greater and wanting to make it something everyone would take on. We call it a best practice. Oh, I'm so sorry. My slide is not working. Not sure what's happening. The final thing that is a part of the 7 first principles is the idea that we're working and we end up only being transactional. We end up driven by financials, by parts and pieces of things. But if you think about a child, let's go back because I think that's easy. And that will give a bit of an overview, I think, about what it is that I'm really inviting you to experience here, not take notes on. You're welcome to have the slides, happy to send them to you. But what I'm working on is what it means to work on the right-hand side or the top of the paradigm hierarchy, which is based on living systems, which is looking at a child to see them as a whole being who aspires, who is on their way to contributing, to making a difference, and being able to be with them in the same way you're with the land when you go there, with a place, be with a child and experience and discover and reveal their essence. I do this with businesses, with business leaders, all the way back to the founding. If you can do that, you bring something totally amazing to life for that child and for yourself. Now we can work on their potential. Now we can develop. I shouldn't say work on, I should say work with. I'm very, very westernized. And although I've spent decades and decades working on doing that 12-year conditioning in my mind, it still shows up. So working with the potential, bringing the ableness building, not expertise, because then I'm back into the epistemological model of extract value. And I help and work with see that child nested in a family, in a community, in a life, on its way to being a part of something amazing in the world. If I can do that, I now can be quiet. And I can, instead of trying to scale or make something bigger, I can say at this point, at this place in time, what is nodal? How do I enter in a way that I can experience and have a strong sense of being able to connect with, have my body feel what is the work to do? That's my hope when I'm working with individuals in our institute and through all of the roles that I'm blessed to play, is to not go in and figure out how to scale what I already know and transfer it to people, but go see what is happening there and work from the principles that really help me be present in a moment. The final thing you can do if you are with that child is, instead of being direct and telling them what to do and what their values should be and how they know when they're right, is you build a field of discovery, a field in which understanding can arise, where life can come really toward us and through us. And you know, when you go into a community, at times you can feel that there's a field of tension or worry. And even when no one tells you the words, you can feel it. You can also feel it when there is hope and involvement and appreciation. And so learning to build that field starts with the sense of wholes. Otherwise, we get trapped in, we fragment, we categorize, and therefore we have to make it generic. And once you're not in the category, you're a problem and you're likely to be seen there forever. The movement of moving from the right-hand side to the idea that, through the idea that each life form is unique at a point in time, and to be able to move with these 7 first principles has been the greatest gift for me. And I write about it a lot. So if I'd be happy to share how you can make connections to readings about this. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Carol, for sharing your knowledge of our regenerative capabilities. We're now moving on to our final speaker in this first panel, and this is Bill Reed, who is an internationally recognized planning consultant, design process facilitator, and lecturer, teacher, and author in sustainability and regeneration. He is principal at Regenesis, Inc., a regenerative design, living systems integrator, and education organization. His work centers on creating the framework for and managing an integrative, whole, and living systems design process with the objective to improve the overall quality of the physical, social, and spiritual life of our living places and therefore the planet. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you all for having me. Let me get my screen shared and we'll begin. Oops. Sorry. Is that working?
Yes, that looks great, Bill.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. So how does this thinking of Tiokasin and Carroll's translate into architectural meaning? And we have been working on this for about 25 years and obviously are still figuring it out. But let's give it a shot for the next 15 minutes or so. So building on Carroll's 4 paradigms, worth taking a refresher here. So the evolved capability paradigm is whether with people or life sheds, every living entity asks that we approach it individually to reveal and support its unique potential. So what does that mean? We translate that into the term regenerative development, that we need to develop this new thinking. Regenerative projects seek to develop the inherent potential in everyone and every living system they touch. Regenerative design, by the way, emerges from this understanding. So this precedes design, if you will. So what is this inherent potential? Well, obviously, this little boy is likely to be an airline pilot. Sebastião Salgado's family farm in Brazil, after he retired from photographing war-torn Africa, was a completely destroyed ecosystem, but it had the potential of what it wanted to express itself as, and it was able to be recovered. The inherent potential of the atmosphere during COVID in Beijing. It's there if we actually let it emerge and participate with it properly. The inherent potential of this civil engineer's view of a stream. Sorry, that sounds a little snarky, but that's the way we used to think. Actually, this is that same stream 3 years later. Places are living organisms, and they have inherent potential, whether it's Pittsburgh or Barcelona or Park City or Seattle. They are unique, and until we understand that uniqueness, in a way, we shouldn't be building there at all. So a simple example of this is from a small project couple of decades ago that we worked on is the Brattleboro Food Co-op in Brattleboro, Vermont. And we were hired to look at and develop a LEED Gold grocery store. And we asked the question, do you want LEED or do you want sustainability? Because there's a difference. And they refreshingly said, well, we want both. So with that in mind, we went to work and looked at the nature of this place. And Brattleboro has a strong localization movement. If you've ever been there, community and food is a focus. They have the March of the Heifers there in the upper right. That's the major parade and celebration in the town. And the idea of working landscape is very present. So with that in mind, we took a look at this grocery store and we took about 5 minutes of research to understand that the average bite of food in the United States travels 3,600 miles. No matter what we would have done with that grocery store in terms of efficient refrigeration cases or efficient light bulbs or non-toxic paint or stormwater management, we still would have not addressed the 800-pound gorilla of energy use and sustainability. So we asked the question, what happens if there's a truckers' strike? And they said, well, we're out of business in 3 days. So let's take a look at the grocery store. And the first bin we came to in the grocery store was the apple bin, and the apples were from New Zealand. And there were strawberries from Chile, or California, and blueberries from Chile, thereby giving the idea that there's an awful lot of energy being expended here. And not only that, not a sustainable condition if the supply line ever stops. So this is a picture of the grocery store, which are all the farms in these light and green splotches have been abandoned over the last 50 years. I don't think there was one in the area operating. The soil was destroyed, extracted from in multiple extraction periods over 200 years, water polluted, and actually the best soil was in downtown Brattleboro. Of course, people say, well, we built in downtown Brattleboro, but no, you've only built on 35% of the land. Where did most towns feed themselves in World War II? And the Victory Gardens actually fed the country. There's no reason we can't start there again. So this grocery store was programmed to become an agricultural and soil extension service to teach people how to grow their own food again, and a cannery for them to can their own food, a daycare center to take care of the kids, forest service extension to begin to work on the restoration of the land that had been extracted from so long, a credit union to loan money for small farmers to start up again, probably missing something, and by the way, a grocery store. Well, it took about a year for them to process that information, and but at the end, they figured out, and it was kind of a gigantic aha moment for them, is that the building wasn't as important as we thought. What it did is it inspired a process to continually regenerate the system. In other words, staying in the game of evolution, which is really what all this is about. And yes, the building was built, but the ongoing work continues. And the framing is one of shifting from transaction to reciprocity. In a transactional relationship, the project is the center, and we reach out to actually influence or be influenced by. If I'm a developer, I'll give a neighborhood a swimming pool or a community center to get permission to build. And that ultimately ends up in typically a compromised situation. But when we go to a city, a community, the new relationship is one where we look at the potential for the life shed, at least the city and the ecological system it sits within. And the developer or client become no more or less important than any other stakeholder. And we build a field of relationship in support of the potential of the essence expression, to use Carol's term, of the nature of this place. And that shifts into this mutual dance of reciprocity. It's very powerful. And so getting back to one more perspective on that, in terms of these whole systems we're talking about, whether it's a site or the neighborhood or the life shed that you're part of, each of them need to be seen as a living whole and then understood to add value to each other reciprocally, mutually adding value. And that's the nature of the initial design process, is to begin to see and explore what is this value adding process to each of these nested wholes. Going back to Brattleboro for a second, not only did we look at adding value to Brattleboro itself in a sustainable and actually truly sustainable food-oriented grocery store, but where is that food coming from? But also it shifted into the co-op system overall in New England. And so the idea of adding this experience and teaching the other co-ops how to think this way created this rapid expansion of relationship that would not have happened if we only looked at the building as the objective. And the building does emerge from this, of course. So what is the role of architects? Now, I'm not sure, I don't want to say that architects shouldn't be designing beautiful buildings. That's why most of us go into this profession. But the most beautiful building is unsuccessful if it's located in a dying community. And a community is unsuccessful if it's located in a dying ecosystem. So the true expression of beauty, as Haya referred to, requires us to engage all those dimensions. So I like to say your project is not the project. The project really we're working on is the health of the living system, and then design emerges from this. Just a little bit on, I think it confuses us a lot. We see so many of these activities going on out there, the biophilic movement, there's biomimicry, there's LEED, there's Living Building Challenge, and all of those are really important. And I would call them generative actions. The question is then how do we regenerate those? Because we forget, life changes, life evolves. So how do we stay in the game of evolution? And ultimately, the concept of sustainability, if you consider it at its richest meaning, is impossible without regeneration. So it's not that we don't do any of these wonderfully generating green thinking and environmental and ecological thinking. It's that we actually have to rebirth our culture to engage that over time. Evolutionary health just doesn't happen. It's actually a conscious practice. So a couple more simple examples, maybe not so simple, but quick. This can scale to anything. We've been consulting in Vancouver for the last decade on 2 wastewater treatment plants. And the first one was a $750 million secondary wastewater treatment plant in North Vancouver. And the aim was to save the taxpayer money. That's what we were told was the most important thing. Well, there's not a whole lot of potential in that. There's not a whole lot of motivation in that either. But as we worked through the project, we helped the design team see that, in fact, if we considered the site as the whole ridge through bay harbor relationship, we would have a lot more to work with in terms of influence. And so this was the field of design. And we helped the community see that if we could cohere everyone around working together onto why a wastewater treatment plant was important, and then how they could actually make that relationship work to help themselves in their own community, we would be a lot better off than just fighting some smelly wastewater treatment plant. So the result was a strengthening of partnerships, and it ended up being, let's see, we saved, as a result of that, it was the first unanimous vote in British Columbia history on an infrastructure project, 18 months faster permit time, 25% reduction in design time. We saved 98% of the change orders allocated for the design, which actually paid for the entire design. And every participant, Miller Hall Architects, AECOM, CH2M Hill, Jacobs, all said it was the greatest project they'd ever worked on. Not because it was so great as an object, but it was because it actually sponsored new relationships and new states of being with each other. That's what people really resonate to. We were hired for the same team was hired for the next plant in Iona Island. And this is a $4 billion plant next to the airport. And the aim shifted. This shows how evolutionary thinking shifts. The aim shifted to saving the orca whales, the killer whales. And that shifted the entire design team, not to work on just a wastewater treatment plant, which we have here, of course, but to work on the ecological systems that were creating the pollution in the Fraser River and the Salish Sea. What was even equally significant is we worked with the Musqueam people whose land Vancouver is located on. And that First Nations relationship had not gone anywhere for 30 or 40 years with lawyers talking to lawyers. We kept insisting that they come in and participate in the workshops that we were doing. This is a 135-person design team. And finally, someone showed up and said, this is the way we need to be in a relationship. And that broke open the whole reconciling process with the Musqueam people in Vancouver, unlike it has never been, not been until now. So we can have multiple effects if we actually focus on what is significant to the community we're building in. And by the way, it is not us doing this work. It's us inviting those to participate with a greater aim. They take the responsibility and go for it. So as of last July, Metro Vancouver is proceeding with all 20 recommended ecological projects, not to mention Musqueam, not to mention zero carbon, zero energy building. So massive change is possible. And if we actually focus on developing a living network of relationship with the stakeholders, we can actually have a rippling effect, like dropping a stone in a pond. Building this co-evolutionary capability and helping people to see the larger potential of the system they're part of can actually link and integrate people in ways they have not been able to do so for, well, maybe for the last 100 years, 200 years. We work in our silos, and we've got to get out of these silos. So a high leverage design process, projects, and co-evolutionary relationships emerge from this understanding. By the way, one more thing. You know, there are 4,037 cities in the world, larger than 100,000 people. if we actually work place by place around the planet, we can't heal the planet. The planet is too big, it's too abstract, but we can heal the planet place by place. Eleanor Ostrom in her Nobel laureate economics work proved that place we can manage, we can understand. So if we get 3.5% of these 4,037 cities, 3.5% is the common tipping point. My premise, maybe a conceit, but it gives me a little bit of hope. If we get 141 cities to transform themselves, it will have a rippling effect on the planet. So that's my personal goal, to work on these first 141 cities. Maybe we have a shot. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Bill. Thanks for sharing your whole living systems design approach with us. And thank you again to all of our speakers for sharing their knowledge on regeneration. So we're now going to embark on a regenerative workshop, which will be for sort of the last 15, 20 minutes of this panel. And in keeping with a regenerative approach, we'd like to open up this panel to the audience, as Carol referred to earlier. And we'd like to welcome you to share what this new knowledge from our panel, from our panelists, has generated in you. So audience, I'm going to ask you 3 questions that I'd like you to respond to in the chat function of Zoom. And these are, what did you notice got disrupted for you in terms of what you just heard from our panelists? So this notion of disruption. What did you notice about yourself? Did you find yourself rejecting or debating certain aspects that are brought up by our speakers? And then lastly, our third question is, what are you taking away from our first panel? What are you taking away from this today? So please, we'll give you a bit of time to post that in the chat. And feel free to respond to all 3 prompts, or maybe just one that you find particularly meaningful. Great. So I've got one here about looking at what strategies we might have for relearning intuition and wisdom in our approach to regenerative processes and design. In terms of our panel, maybe Teo Kassan, this seems to maybe, well, it sort of aligns with all of our panelists, but Teo Kassan, would you maybe want to be the first one to approach this question? And I'll say it again. So how can we learn or relearn intuition and wisdom?
Again, yes. I think that's inherent in all of us. I think we have to understand where our languages come from and the mental reality that was enforced, I would say, by the Occidental nations of America and America and Europe, or USA actually, and how we ended up speaking this language. And when I think about, the wisdom that we often are referring to is how the earth was before we got there. And so, for instance, old growth trees, the way the river runs, and we adapted in our living conditions to the earth rather than planning or changing the earth for our comfort needs. You see, so we didn't extract; we actually added to. So, for instance, to retain or even find some vestiges of this original thinking is even today when we put up tipis. T-I-P-I is a Lakota word. It means many homes and stars and coming to the earth. And what we did was when we went out to find a place, of course, we had the songs and the dances, and the children would go out, and first they would dance and they would bless the place. Now this, you would say, is religion or myth or some, something that's quaint and nice, but these actually work as if you could change water by merely understanding the nature of it. But we have how would I say it, a word that I think I can translate wakan in our language. Really, you could say it's sacred or holy, but that's a noun. And we go back to understanding things alive and in verbs. Everything is in motion. And so this word wakan really means to consciously apply mystery to everything. And so when you live as if you live with a philosophy or religion or spiritual way, is that your body is actually in the soul, and all of life is that soul. Midakuye oyasi. We're all related to that because that's what our composition makes up. And I think that's a one instruction, so to speak, that you can take with you and start understanding each elemental consciousness that you're going to build with. That is actually the same makeup of your body. So there is no distinction except in the form between the elemental consciousnesses that really have intelligence. So I think the anthropocentric way is not to accept these other ways that are much older than this new way of thinking and designing. So I think referring to the land and those indigenous peoples who are still living there, and I think that would be one way of understanding your own heritage, your own lineage, is what did the etymology of the language we speak now? Are we speaking that language from the original seeds of communication with the earth rather than just the anthropocentric sense of describing things through and to and for and only with human beings or humans, right? Because we get too wrapped up in the human doing and we forget about the being behind the human. So I think these intuitive values that are, as you say, is wisdom, is actually having to do with experiencing these older knowledges and elemental consciousnesses. And I think that's what I see. King Carol was talking about the whole. And so we have this phrase, I think we're pretty sure that there's other thought processes out there. Yeah.
Thank you, Tiokasin. This idea of learning from our sort of ancient wisdom and listening, as well as sort of an active engagement. Carol, I think that you might want to jump in here.
Well, I'm just wanting to say I'm inspired by what I'm watching people write over here. And that's what I was hoping this section would be, where like people are talking about unlearning. And I do feel like, I mean, Tiokasin talked about this, the 12-year time it takes to be conditioned to authority and conformance. And it takes us probably the same amount of time. I'm not sure, Tiokasin, but it probably takes the same amount to uncondition all that, right? So to see Shayla comment on the unlearning, I'm inspired by that. So I wanted to comment on that. There's some other great reflections in here.
Wonderful. Bill, did you have anything to add to that comment, or maybe we can pull something else from the chat?
Onward. Let's go.
Onward. Okay.
Bill, look at the one where you're talking about the connection to place as an urban planner. You are not an urban planner, you're an architect, but I bet there are urban planners in what you do. Can you even talk about the role they play?
Well, I'm not sure what that, yeah, I saw that. There's so many, these are great. I'm sort of sucked in. Place by place as an urban planner. Well, this is how we work, is place by place. Now, what is place is the question. And that's why I put up this nested system idea. It's not, a lot of people ask, which whole do you work on? I'm a whole, my family's a whole, my community's a whole. So how do you, it's almost a paradox for people. And it's all those wholes exist at the same time. And as Jan Smuts said, they're holons and holarchy, they're relationships. And we actually have to identify those holes and then add value, understand, that helps us understand where value exchange is occurring. And we can work practically with that. So place, and also the idea of place making, which is often confused with what we would call place sourced design. Place making is kind of an anthropocentric idea that I'm making place. That's an important design aspect of any urban and non-urban situation. But first we start with the source of being, of who this place is, in order to inform the place making that we do to support all life, not just humans. I'm not sure if that addresses the question, but I'll stop there.
Yeah,
Great.
Julia, I see another one I'd love to comment on.
Yeah, Carol,
And
jump right in if you see one that
uh,
inspires you.
Yeah, oh, there's so many good ones here. And there's one, Ray Mann asked about saying, I'm on this, I'm strongly interested, but boy, is that multiple entities, long-term interest difficult. Could you share with us your experience? And I wanted to share one idea that took me a long time to learn, and I have to relearn it all the time, which is it isn't about doing any more than Tikasan's talking about doing things to land. It isn't about doing it to leaders. It is a developmental process. It is always like today, I was trying to instigate a bit of development, right? Rather than the experts on the panel hand off stuff, you take notes and go use it, to experience it. And so if you think a little bit about what we were asking you to do here, for me, it's a lot about bringing ideation that I create off of other people's words, not necessarily taking their words, going and experiencing it, and then reflecting. So if I gave one thing I think I've learned the most about is until you can build a reflective mind into an organization or a community, it's very difficult to bring the kind of things because you can't quiet that mind. So I do think that is, well, I'm not even going to say it's hard work. I say it's mindful work. You have to bring reflection. Is scary. All those of you who helped put this panel together, I disrupted you like crazy, right? Let's do this a different way. Let's experience it. You have to have the courage to do that, Ray. That's what my experience is.
Yeah, I think this notion of disruption is very refreshing for everyone on this panel. Bill or Tiokasin, did you have anything to add on that next comment? Otherwise, I have a comment from the chat I'd like to post.
Yeah, let's go with a comment. Yeah.
Great. So we have one here from William Renner, who's wondering about how you, this is directed more for Bill, but please other panelists chime in. And they're wondering, Bill, how do you prepare clients to look sort of beyond the project? And knowing your work, Bill, I think this is just such a salient question in terms of that process and sort of understandings of how long a regenerative approach takes and the sort of your involvement in that process.
Great. Okay. So the way we start is we take the mind off the project onto the system. And that means we're looking at the potential of the system. Again, and most developers can see this right away. And we get hired by developers a lot who are interested in this, if you will, the deeper green agenda. And because they know that if their building is located in a dying community, their investment goes away. So it's not very hard to get them to see what's out here. The question is how do you work on that? And does it cost them to do so? And in fact, it actually costs them a lot less because typically developers hire lawyers to do transactional relationship with the community. We find that you don't have to hire a lawyer at all. You don't have to hire a public relations firm. And the relationship with the community, it allows for a much more positive relationship that allows approvals to happen in places where developers have never gotten approvals before. That we also tell the community the developer deserves a profit, but the developer doesn't deserve to tell you what they're building. So let's look and see how we can harmonize that or reconcile that. And we've never seen that fail, actually. If we've never seen, I'm going to qualify that. We've never seen that fail if you take the time to understand that potential of place and our role in it. And that takes about 2 to 4 weeks. We could talk for hours on that, so I'll just.
Wonderful. Thanks, Bill. Does anyone else in the panel want to contribute anything to sort of that strand?
I'd like to say something about what Bill just said. Basically, he's building in a dying community, a dying system, basically. And I wanted to bring it into another place, dying in a dying ecosystem, building in a dying ecosystem, and who you can hire and who you cannot. So in an indigenous way, we'll be thinking, can you hire an eagle? Can you hire a fish? Can you hire a deer, basically, to tell them and communicate with them where you can build and how much you can build without just extracting any more than we have as a human race, basically. So I want to put that into what Bill is saying, because it's all regenerative. This language means to renew our thinking, is to not tether it to the old world thinking of that seems to be not conducive with the earth. So the economics we talk about is always out of the Western mindset, and the economics Native people are talking about has to do with ecological systems, right? And that's why we say, let's look at the relationship we already have with the earth, rather than here's what we think we can have a relationship with the earth. So it's a very different mindset, but it's all in there in that same circle of thinking.
Agreed.
I see one question I'd like to give a two-sentence answer to. Can this
Wonderful,
work?
Carol.
Oh, can this work in underserved areas? I wish we had time, and I'd tell you the story of Joburg in South Africa and building it out from, like Bill is talking about, with Story of Place, and working all the way into the townships, which were people sleeping, in huts with tin roofs in some case and dirt floors, and the amazing transformation that happened. So it works anywhere that place and people want to come this way.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carol. I'm again, so many wonderful questions and thoughts in the chat. Maybe I'll just pull out a couple key ones, and because we've got to sort of wrap up soon. I really like this idea that was posed by Michelle in terms of sort of how this talk has disrupted the idea of who our stakeholders are, in terms of bringing in deers or the orca whales. Bill, I'm thinking of your project that you were talking about in terms of they are the stakeholders within our projects, and it's important to bring in their needs and their essence, as you've sort of been asking us to do, Carol. Let me see, what else do we have here? Another question which I thought was salient, it might be a bit broad, but I think because we've got so much knowledge that we've had from our three panelists, Susanna asked, where do we begin? And I know this can sort of seem a bit overwhelming. Maybe because we're running out of time, I would love to get your comments in terms of what would you suggest as a first step for those who are interested in incorporating this perspective, and drawing from this comment of where do we begin if we want to live this regenerative approach. Tio Casson, did you want to maybe go first?
I think I mentioned it in the first time I spoke, is Ake Wikiksuya, which was meaning that the land remembers. And you see, I drive many places within the United States, and you see old dilapidated buildings and maybe things that didn't survive. People came to the western part of the country and they built, and you see these ghost towns because they ran out of mining silver or gold. They ran out of farmland, was not arable enough for them. So this is an example of the lack of experience with land. And I think that we need to be patient with our own individual experience with the land. And even so, with the notion that you would think is just maybe an idea, but to us, it's a real thing. We have to ask the earth again, because we view the earth as always within our language as a living being, even before science has proved it. So let's go to that ancient knowledge, the Akantu, the being from the ancient future now, so that we can do something about this consciousness and work on our attitudes about saving the earth. And all the time, the earth has been saving us. So, and it's been proven with this COVID that if we left the earth alone, look how much she regenerates. So regeneration is maybe just leaving it alone to let it do its own rebirth, as mothers often do. So I just want to add that to it.
Thank you so much, Tio Casson. And I know that we're running out of time. So do Carol or Bill, do you have maybe one sentence each you want to propose? Otherwise, I think we're sort of at the closing of our panel.
I'll say something.
Great.
Don't ask permission to do this work.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Just
well said. Great. Well, we've come to the end of our panel, and thank you to each of our panelists for sharing their knowledge with us today. And in concluding, I'd like to ask Tio Casson to share just some closing remarks with us. as we wrap up this first session.
Yes, thank you, Carol and Bill and Julia for moderating us, and to Haya for asking originally. And how we all got here, I think, is something of a wonder all over the world. I've seen what was put up earlier with Mateo and many, you put it up actually, Julia, and how many people around the world are listening to this, and how effective we can be with each other, and how we have affected the earth, but not so much bringing a sort of a benevolence to saving the earth again. And, because the earth will show us how to listen, because we can't teach earth lessons. The earth has always lessons for us. And I think, and if you feel that the earth has an intelligence, and we can never outthink the earth. So I think we need to get off our little high horse attitude and come down to the basics. We can't be so heavenly with imagination and creativity that we're no earthly good anymore. And I just wanted to put it, just say it with that. And just for example, coming from the youth, my 4-year-old daughter at that time, she asked me, if Mother Earth is our mother, then who is the mother of Mother Earth? And immediately, appropriately, I called my mother, and she said, in our language, Nasuya, which means seed, that the brain, all the intellectualism that we have up here is actually a seed of the heart. And within that heart, you need to speak the earth language, because earth is our heart and our source of all who we are. And maybe that's practical for you to take back with you, or maybe let's not see what we can take away, but what we can give rather than what we take away. Because this is not a package. This is something that we need to do. And it's inherent that we just don't hope anymore. We have to do what's required. So I'd like to leave that and just say thank you all for listening to this panel. It's been thank you for it. Yes.
Well, I've overcome with excitement and gratitude for this inspiring panel on regeneration. And thank you, Bill, Carol, Tiokasin, and Julia for sharing your insights and how we could apply them to redesigning our world. As I learned from Bill, climate change is not a problem, but a symptom of the constructs that pervade in our consciousness. I am extremely excited to have read all the comments from everybody that is here gathering with us as we rethink our future. With a time in our hands, it's time to shift to our second panel. And I certainly hope that our recent experience will enhance how we listen and internalize the body of work that is about to be presented by a diverse roster of leaders whose work and initiatives are in support of the principles of regeneration. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers for our second panel, Regenerative Design, Systems, Technologies, and Strategies. Walter Mayer will share projects at the forefront of resilience. Atosa Soltani will inspire us with her Indigenous rights and rainforest campaign initiatives. Tom Newmark will share the virtues of regenerative agriculture and landscape for climate mitigation. Victoria Kazaya will inspire us to learn from nature's wisdom through the practice of biomimicry. And finally, Eva Long will probe our minds towards design practice through self-inquiry. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Adriana Pablos-Jorna, who will be our moderator moving forward. Currently pursuing a Master in Design Studies at the GST within the program of Urbanism, Landscape, and Ecology, Adriana is an architect based in Madrid whose work navigates through the realms of design, research, and teaching. She works on architectural and urban approaches to improve cities' adaptability with a particular focus on housing. Adriana, we welcome you.
Thank you, Haya, and hello, everyone. It is my honor to be here today with you, the audience, while moderating this amazing set of speakers bringing hands-on approaches to regenerative design from various fields and manifold perspectives. About the logistics for this second panel, we'll be having 5 presentations, followed by a collective conversation around regenerative design and its strategies. So please let us know your thoughts, your ideas, your questions, as you have been doing already, to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. So we can easily include your voices in the conversations. Thank you. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker, Walter Meyer. Walter is a GSD alum, a landscape and urban designer and educator, and a community organizer for climate justice. Please, Walter, come in. The floor is all yours.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for making time for us today. I'm moved by the presentations today by the Indigenous leaders and academics who are bringing together evidence-based Western thinking with, you know, this ancient past and ancient future happening. At the time that I was at the GSD decades ago now, early 2000, it was a very binary situation where you were either a cult of personality design star, or there were the ecologists and environmental engineer types. But that binary was something I had to navigate. And one of the frustrations at the time was resilience thinking was emerging out of academia, and there were not enough built projects to understand what that means physically. Although academically and intellectually, there was a very clear framework. And so, working after a period of time of academia, I was inspired by the landscape architect Ian McHarg, and worked for his former firm, which was Wallace McHarg, Robertson Todd, WMRT, in the 1990s, and learned a lot about that legacy professionally. And then later on worked at the director of sustainability at Cooper Robertson and Partners in Manhattan, one of the densest spots on the planet, to understand how McHargism and regionalism and ecology at the scale of the bioregion, as well as cities at Cooper Robertson, and bring that together in our firm LOLA, our local office. How cities as a socio-ecological organism can function in a post-binary condition. There is no separation of nature in the city. And looking to build these systems was sort of the focus of the early part of my career. And one of the first large-scale opportunities to convert an entire city came across with the governor of Puerto Rico at the time for the 3rd largest city, Mayagüez. Mayagüez is an indigenous name. It was retained through the Spanish colonization and is there today as a socio-ecological organism on the west side of the island. When we arrived on the project, the $55 million budget wasn't enough to address some major conditions, some borderline illegal situations where stormwater pipes were leaching into the sand, into the bay, causing fish kills, taking the oxygen out of the water, algae blooms that were covering the coral reef, so the polyps could not get the sunlight they need to flourish, causing bleaching. And the entire Mayagüez Bay was nearly a dead bay. It was an industrial landscape with tuna canning factories. And the image on the bottom right is adjacent to the city, was this intact, ecological system that had some important tools to inform how the city can be retrofitted. And the diagram on the upper left corner shows how these ancient creeks were put in these storm pipes and flushing water into the bay with all the pollutants from the street and the city runoff. What we learned from these intact creek systems adjacent to the city as an ecological analog is that we don't have to restore an entire river and erase the city. We just need to rearrange the relationship between people and the sea using some of the devices that nature offers. And that is that there was a dune system between the salt water and the fresh water that was kind of nature's check valve that separated, the fresh water, which is nutrients that are wonderful food for the forest, but are toxic for the reef. That nature's check valve, that sand dune, would open up in a major storm event, and within a few hours close. Next slide. Now, it's important to note that you can't have resiliency without regenerative. This project had hard infrastructure and living infrastructure. That living infrastructure, the regenerative systems, are what makes resiliency happen, because without that, it is just mitigation. Next slide. The project, the slide on the left shows the bay before construction, and the slide on the right shows a photograph of the bay after construction, when all the roots are interconnected and polishing stormwater through constructed wetlands. Next slide. Then Hurricane Maria hits and tested this project. And we showed how the metrics of imperfection, that this project did not perform completely as designed. In fact, it was 91% resilient. We lost 9% of the coastal forest to Hurricane Maria, but the forest did keep the urban flotsam out of the city, the floating debris that comes with hurricanes. But the project's core system stayed intact. The phytoremediation systems of mangroves that you saw David present, and the oysters and the base of the mangroves continue to polish water throughout the storm. An architectural record documented how the businesses behind the system were protected by the surge and later by what was the heaviest rain event ever measured in the history of the project. Next slide. And the metrics from that project started to inform Hurricane Sandy's recovery in New York City. So New York City was endowed with nearly a $60 billion investment in the region, the metropolitan area of New York. And a lot of the metrics from Mayaguez set the tone for how New York can build one with nature. Next slide. And some of this thinking started to upload into the Obama administration's white papers on what are the limits to resiliency in the policy space. Next slide. An important document called Incorporating Natural Infrastructure and Ecosystem Services took into incorporation how regenerative thinking can build parity in the benefit cost analysis that federal government takes into looking at hard infrastructure are now required to look at living infrastructure or regenerative systems on par. Next slide. And it led to the Obama administration awarding our firm the Champions of Change Award. Next slide. And from that project, we started to scale up districts. This is Coral Gables district in the city of Miami, where, next slide, we excavated the entire public realm so that the forest can reconnect as it once did hundreds of years ago, instead of street trees that are disconnected. Next slide. And I have to stop here, but this is a regenerative city being built in New York City. This is a 90-acre site, multi-billion-dollar project that our firm is master planning currently with multiple city agencies. Next slide. Arvern East, you can look up the project, arverneast.com. We'll have waste reuse systems, urban farms, and chefs in the main street. Next slide. The buildings are continuous, cloud to groundwater living systems, all the energy from the site and waste being reused. Next slide. Most of the project that's being built in phases is edible at coastal natives. Next slide. That also, in the nature of regenerative systems, are not about the trees, but about the root system that hold the dune and swales intact to manage water and surge run up. Next slide. And we'll finish with that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Walter.